Do you sometimes just lose control? Like a little bit, or maybe a lot? I know I have a lot in the past. In fact, I've had a real big struggle with emotional regulation. And that's what I want to talk about in today's episode of the Self-Improvement Room. Hey, welcome to episode number 55 of the Self-Improvement Room. I am your host, Kristy Davis, and I am pretty excited. Actually, I'm a little bit scared because there's some stuff that'll probably come out in this episode that might make you think differently of me. But I am excited to talk about today's topic because it is something that I have struggled with my entire life, mainly related to my ADHD, but I think it's something that we all struggle with from time to time. And I think that if we can learn to understand it better and implement it and pass it on to our family and our friends and our kids, then we really could change the world. And that is emotional regulation or emotional intelligence, but more specifically, regulation. I want to talk about why emotional control matters and some of the costs of not thinking before you act. And trust me, I have a lot of experience in this. All right, before we jump into the episode, I want to point you to our Facebook group for the Self-Improvement Room. We will leave the link in the show notes for you, but it's a group that you can join and you can share your experiences, you can share your stories, any advice or tips you've got, or you can ask for. It's a community of sharing and caring and kindness and compassion. So we will leave the link for that group in the show notes. Make sure you join us. All right, emotions. Emotions drive much of what we do, from how we react in very stressful situations to the way we interact with others. They can help us achieve great things, or they can pull us into a spiral of stress and poor decision making. Now, emotional regulation is the ability to manage and respond to emotional experiences in a balanced, healthy, and constructive way. It's not, and I want to make this very clear, it is not about suppressing or ignoring emotions. It's about recognizing, understanding, and working through them effectively. Now, when emotional regulation is lacking, and I pause there because I think that's most of my life, life can become a roller coaster of highs and lows, and it really does cause significant disruption to your personal well-being and your relationships. Now, in this episode, 55, we are going to explore the impact of not being able to regulate your emotions and how it can have effect on so many aspects and areas of your life. And I also want to talk about some practical steps that you can take to regain control. And I've been using these for the last few years, and it has impacted me very positively, but also very significantly. So let's first look at the consequences of poor emotional regulation. Now, I'll quickly tell you a very short version of a story, but I decided, it's about 3 years ago, that I needed to very much work on this part of my personal growth journey because usually, typically speaking, I could handle my emotions, but I had bought my new car and let's just say somebody hit the mirror accidentally while I was in it because they'd parked very close. And I was in the car and I just gave them a look and they responded with, "What's your problem?" And I said, "You hit my car." And then they did it on purpose. And then let's just say the following events scared and disappointed me so much that I promised myself then and there I would never, ever, ever respond with such dysregulation. Let's just say I was a very vulgar version of myself that day. And I didn't ever want to make anyone feel the way I made this person feel again. And I didn't want to make myself feel what I felt after that experience. So failing to regulate your emotions can have very profound consequences. And I'm talking not for me, thankfully, but I'm talking right up to, life in prison. And a lot of the times, even if they're not as profound as that, they do kind of ripple out into the other areas of your life. So I want to give you 4 problems that arise. Like, there are many problems, but I want to talk about 4 in particular that arise when emotional regulation is not achieved or maintained. So number 1, it strains relationships. And I think that's one of the obvious and kind of immediate consequences of poor emotional regulation. And that's the toll it takes on relationships. So whether that's with friends or family or romantic partners, like relationships or colleagues, unregulated emotions can lead to misunderstandings, unnecessary conflict, and emotional outbursts that damage trust and connection. Just have a think about within your own family or somebody else's family that you know of where the relationship is fractured or broken. And it simply didn't have to be that way if participants were a little more regulated in their responses and in their actions. When our emotions aren't controlled, small disagreements can escalate into full-blown arguments or worse, and unresolved anger or frustration over time can turn into resentment, and often does. And that can often end relationships, like romantic relationships especially. People who can't manage their emotions often react impulsively, and they say or do things that they later regret. If they don't regret them, then that's a whole other problem that we need to look at. But over time, that can take a toll on loved ones and cause them to distance themselves, and that can leave you feeling isolated and misunderstood. Now, an example would be, imagine being in a situation where you feel a bit put off by a colleague or a friend, and instead of calmly addressing the issue, you lash out, saying hurtful things that you cannot take back. Even though your reaction was momentary, the damage to that relationship could be long-lasting, and that could lead to significant strains on interactions and even permanent distance between you and that friend. So that is just one small example of how you can strain relationships through emotional dysregulation. Number 2 is poor mental health. That is another major consequence of not being able to regulate your emotions. It really takes a toll on mental health. Poor emotional regulation can lead to a heightened sense of anxiety, because you're always kind of on eggshells. You don't know how anybody's going to interact with you, therefore you don't know how you're going to respond or react. And that can create a sense of anxiety. It can create depression and even chronic stress. So when emotions like anger and sadness and fear are left unchecked, they become overwhelming. And that leads to feelings of helplessness and sometimes even despair. A lack of emotional regulation can create a feedback loop where negative emotions compound, and it makes it harder to see solutions or maintain a positive mindset. And that can lead to, once again, increased isolation. It can lead to rumination, which means thinking about those those moments, and that then creates that or recreates that anxiety and stress. And it can also create avoidance behaviors. I kind of call it the ostrich, kind of put your head in the sand and just avoid anything that's going to cause any conflict or any kind of emotion that you are unable to deal with. And again, all of those contribute to mental health challenges. So without the ability, let's say, to regulate sadness or disappointment, someone might ruminate on failures or setbacks. And over time, that constant focus on those negative experiences, so failing, can lead to depression and anxiety. And that makes it even harder to break free from that cycle of emotional distress. So it's really, really important to understand that emotional regulation plays a big role in mental health. Number 3, it can actually cause physical issues. And there is a lot of research that backs the idea of the mind and body being deeply connected. And emotional turmoil can have a direct effect on physical health. So stress caused by emotional dysregulation triggers the release of cortisol and other stress hormones. And when the body kind of remains in that state of chronic stress all of the time, it can lead to several different health problems, including things like high blood pressure, a weakened immune system, so you can get easily sick, digestive issues. That's probably why I had reflux for part of my life, and heart disease. And when emotions are poorly managed, people might also turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms like, overeating, overindulging, substance abuse, or avoidance of doing any physical activity. So those behaviors then compound the physical effects of stress, and that again can lead to long-term health problems. So an example of that is if someone is unable to regulate feelings of anxiety or anger, they might use food, alcohol, or drugs as a way to cope. So over time, as you can imagine, that can lead to obesity, it can lead to addiction, and it can lead to other forms of mental health issues over time. So the physical toll of emotional dysregulation is often invisible at first, but its long-term effects can be quite profound. All right, number 4, impulsivity and poor decision making. So these are, again, the consequences of emotional regulation or dysregulation, so poor regulation. So impulsivity and decision making. So when emotions take the driver's seat, decision making can become very clouded. So what happens is our thinking brain, called our prefrontal cortex, kind of shuts down and goes to what we call the limbic part of our brain, the emotional center of our brain. And that's what I say to my husband. I'm like, I'm sorry, I just completely went limbic. Like, it means I went offline. I didn't know what I was saying. I didn't know how to stop myself because I couldn't get my prefrontal cortex or my thinking brain back online. So impulsivity is a hallmark of poor emotional regulation. So that means, that's where decisions are made based on immediate emotional reactions rather than thoughtful consideration. And you'll find a lot of people, especially in correctional facilities, just have poor impulsivity, poor emotional regulation, because had they thought it through a little longer, they probably wouldn't have done what they did to get them there. So again, it can lead to poor reactions. It can lead to stuff like quitting your job in the heat of the moment. Not smart, have done. It can look like making a large purchase out of frustration. Very expensive, have done. Or saying something in an argument that has really profound, far-reaching consequences, and have done. Yes. Impulsive behaviors are driven by unchecked emotions and even more difficult for somebody with neurodiversity, so ASD or ADHD. Unchecked emotions often result in those feelings of regret and guilt. And over time, repeated impulsivity can lead to significant life disruptions, from financial difficulties to career setbacks. So it's an example, I guess, would be if somebody becomes overwhelmed with stress at work, they might impulsively decide to quit without a backup plan, which leaves them financially unstable. Or they might lash out at somebody during an argument and they might sever important relationships, all because they couldn't pause, reflect, and respond thoughtfully. And it's not that easy. Like, it's not as easy as just pausing, reflecting, and responding thoughtfully. I understand that. But we do have to learn to do it. And that's what I want to talk about next, is how to start regulating your emotions. I think the good news is that emotional regulation is a skill that can be developed. For some people, it can take time, a lot of time, and practice. But there are several research-backed strategies that can help you gain control over your emotional responses and reduce that negative impact of dysregulation. So the first one is diaphragmatic breathing. And this is the one that I actually use the most because I do find it to be the most effective, and there is a lot of research around this. So learning to breathe correctly, which means using your belly. So when you breathe out, your belly will go in. When you breathe back in, your belly will come back out. Shouldn't be up high in your chest. And if you learn to count, and even there's a strategy called the box breathing method. So that means breathing in for 4, holding for 4, breathing out for 4, holding for 4. By doing this, you're getting your thinking brain back on. You're turning it back on. You're going, okay, I need to breathe, which will straight away reduce the anxiety and stress by 50%. The hardest thing is remembering this in the moment. And the second hardest thing is not wanting to do it because you like feeling angry because you feel justified. And I'm not saying there is no justification. I'm just saying it doesn't help you and it doesn't help anybody else. So breathing straight away. If you're angry, hold your response. Breath out. Take as long as you need. Take as long as you need. Because anything is better than responding without thought. In fact, I now, if I'm cranky and I get an email that, really pisses me off, then I will stop and I will give it a few hours. Sometimes I give it a full day before I respond. Same with text messaging. I've found that to be very effective because in the past, I've made very many mistakes. Shooting my mouth off and thinking, oh my God, why did I say that? I can't undo it. So breathing is the number one tool. Number 2 is mindfulness and self-awareness. So one of those first kind of steps to emotional regulation is becoming aware of what you're feeling and why. So name your emotions. Okay, I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling really mad. I'm feeling resentful. I'm feeling jealous. Naming your emotions allows you to understand what you're feeling. And then you can ask yourself why. And it's this process of understanding what you're feeling and asking why that allows you to get better at emotional regulation. Now, mindfulness is the practice of being present in the moment. And I spoke about mindfulness in the last episode. but it's about observing your thoughts and emotions without judgment. Okay, so it allows you to slow down effectively and recognize those emotional triggers and choose how to respond rather than acting or reacting impulsively. Now, self-awareness involves understanding those root causes of your emotions. So, for example, you might feel frustrated after a conversation with someone, but mindfulness can help you pinpoint whether it's truly the person's actions that upset you or if there's something else underlying, like stress from work or personal insecurities that could be contributing to your feelings. Okay, so how to practice? Start by incorporating mindfulness practices such as your breathing exercises, so the diaphragmatic breathing. Meditation is my number one. And people say, I can't meditate. I can't stop the thoughts. The idea isn't to stop the thoughts. The idea isn't to clear your mind. The idea is to firstly focus on the breath, let the thoughts come, recognize them, be aware of them, and then let them go back to your breathing. And it's that the whole time. And I'm not sure how, really. I mean, I understand it, but I don't understand it on a personal level, but it really helps. It really works. And again, there's a lot of medical research to back meditation, even over medication. And you can also journal. You can put that into your daily routine if writing is something you like to do. But you definitely have to set time aside to reflect on your emotions and identify recurring patterns or triggers. So before I go to bed, while I'm in bed, I think to myself, I reflect on the day. I think, did I do well today? You know, I've got a couple yeses in there in my life. There were many no's for a long time. But actually that's a lie. I never even reflected for a long time. But when before I go to bed, I now reflect on the day. What could have I done better? Why did I respond like that? What is the feeling under there? What is the belief under there that is causing me to respond in a way that is just not appropriate? And then I drift off to sleep. Sometimes I don't get the answer. So you might need to do it a little before you go to sleep. But that is definitely something that has been really helpful to me. That's reflecting. Number three. So we've got breathing, mindfulness and self-awareness. Number 3 is something called cognitive reframing. So it's kind of like changing your perspective. So it's a technique that involves changing the way you interpret the situation. So allowing you to view it from a different kind of more balanced perspective. Again, it can be hard to start with, but it can really help reduce the intensity of those emotional reactions and give you the space to think before you respond. So, for instance, if someone cuts you off in traffic, this is probably one of the only ones that I am still incapable of being emotionally regulated for. But your immediate reaction might be anger or frustration. My immediate reaction is on the horn. Not very good at all. But cognitive reframing, and yes, I do work on this, would be to encourage you to consider alternative explanations, like the possibility that the other person might be rushing off due to an emergency. By changing that kind of narrative in your mind from them being just a rude asshole to them having an emergency, their wife might be giving birth in the back of the car, who knows, you can regulate your emotional intensity of the situation. So bring it down a few notches. So whenever you feel a strong emotional response building, I want you to pause and ask yourself, is there any other way I can view this situation? If that answer is no, then you need to start breathing very quickly. Deep breathing, diaphragmatically. But try to challenge any negative or irrational thoughts and replace them with a more balanced, constructive ones. And number 4, look for and develop healthy coping mechanisms. To regulate your emotions effectively, it's really essential to have strategies that are healthy, that allow you to process your emotions in a safe and constructive way. These strategies can be physical, emotional, or cognitive. And you'll find that, especially younger kids, when you talk about things like self-harm or eating disorders, any way to control their emotions, they are coping strategies. They're coping mechanisms. They're not healthy, but they are their idea of coping mechanisms. And this is why it's so important to develop healthy coping mechanisms. So, for example, regular exercise can help reduce stress and improve your mood. I know most of us don't want to go to the gym, but you could talk to a friend or a therapist who could also provide emotional support and perspective. You can engage in activities that promote relaxation. So things like listening to music can really help lower stress levels and prevent that emotional overwhelm. The key is really to find coping mechanisms that work for you and then use them consistently. Have like a toolbox of coping mechanisms that you can use. Okay, I can listen to music. Okay, I can sit down and listen to the birds drinking a cup of tea, or I can, whatever makes you feel relaxed in the moment. But use them consistently, and then especially use them during those emotionally charged moments. So take those breaths that we talked about in tip number 1, and then pair it with something like going off and listening to music. Make yourself feel better. For me, if I think about Christmas, I instantly feel better. I know for a lot of people that really freaks them out. But for me, that's something that inspires and motivates positive feelings for me. So think about something like that. It's what I would call a positive trigger. All right. So again, make a list of those healthy coping strategies that you can enjoy and that are easy to implement. And then just commit to using them whenever you feel stressed or overwhelmed, rather than turning to unhealthy behaviors like avoidance or substance use or overeating or undereating. So in saying all of that, emotional regulation is crucial to living a balanced and healthy, fulfilling life. When emotions are left unchecked, they can really cause significant disruption to relationships, to your mental and your physical health. And it also impacts your decision-making abilities. The consequences of poor emotional regulation are, honestly, they are so wide-reaching. They affect not only your internal state, but also your external environment. But thankfully, and I am a testament to this, emotional regulation is a skill that can be learned. By practicing mindfulness, breathing, cognitive reframing or perspective taking, and healthy coping mechanisms, you can begin to take control of your emotional experiences, and you can make thoughtful, more constructive choices in how you respond to life's challenges. Now, the journey, I will tell you this, toward emotional regulation is ongoing. But I think with effort and self-awareness, it can definitely lead to a more peaceful life, greater well-being, and much stronger, healthier connections and relationships. So emotional regulation is a big one. In fact, it is so big for me that I am focusing majority of my research and my time to learning as much as I can about emotional regulation, because it's so important as a parent. If you can't regulate your own emotions as a parent, how the hell do you expect your child to? And the next minute, you've got a screaming match. It's important in your relationships. Otherwise, you're going to be consistently arguing. And that can be very hard, and even harder if you're in a relationship with somebody who is neurodiverse. So again, ADHD or ASD. And it can be really difficult in the workplace if you've got a manager or a leader that is emotionally dysregulated. Man, it can really cause a stressful, toxic environment. And that's the same for any employees as well. Anyone that you work with, any of your colleagues, if they are unable to regulate their emotions, then the toxicity in the workplace starts to elevate, and it's detrimental to everybody's health and to the overall organization as well. So emotional regulation is a big one. If we can get a handle on this as a world, as the population, I think that the world would be a better place. We would have far less people incarcerated. I really, truly believe that. So emotional regulation is a very huge, important factor in our lives, and it's a great skill to try and tame. All right, speaking of emotional regulation and skills and taming and becoming better people, I would love you to join our Facebook group, The Self-Improvement Room, where we discuss lots of different topics. I've actually been a bit quiet on there for the last month because I've just come back from the US for a trip there for a month. But we've got lots going on in the community. We support each other. We are compassionate. We are kind. And we talk about how to live more meaningful, impactful lives. So I'll leave the link in the show notes for you, and we hope to see you over there. All right, until next episode of the Self-Improvement Room, which will be number 56, stay safe and stay well.